Book of Kings is a sequel to that of Samuel. We would know of these books as 1st and 2nd Kings. It spans 400 years and covers all the kings that would follow David. As we look at the first couple of chapters, we see Solomon's ascension to the throne. And we know from 1st Chronicles that the kingdom had been promised to Solomon, and we'll see how these events unfold in these chapters. But as you look, we'll kind of get an overview of what we'll be heading towards, all the different kings that would be in the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. A little foreshadowing in that the kingdom does divide. And so this is kind of the path ahead through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. And this, by the way, is coming out of the...
In the 3rd and 4th chapter of 1st Kings, you have the wisdom of Solomon on display. There's a few things right off in the first couple of verses that show a foreshadowing of future trouble for Solomon, being the marriage alliance with Egypt and the other high places in the region. But he would be faithful to God. You see God speaking to him, granting him wisdom based on his good request, and a beautiful story of how that wisdom is demonstrated.
In 1st Kings 5 and 6 and 2nd Chronicles 2 and 3, you have some parallel accounts, a little bit different in the layout of these chapters, but you have the same information about the King Hiram of Tyre. You have Solomon himself building a temple with this other king's help who knew his father, David. You have much that can be gleaned from these passages, but one thing I'd like to bring out, again, the context of the threshing floor on which is laid. We can also connect the dots between Mount Moriah and where Abraham was willing to offer his son Isaac to God. And this concept of a threshing floor is one where the wheat and the tares are separated. And as we get into the New Testament, we'll see the importance of that. But even here in the Old, the concepts are the same, and God himself is setting himself apart for his people. 1 Kings chapter 7 and 2nd Chronicles chapter 4, you have Solomon building palaces, temples. You have so much detail here reminiscent to that of Leviticus. Of course, you have Hiram, but now also an artisan that is helping out as well. Flesh out. 1 Kings chapter 8 and 2nd Chronicles chapter 5, you have the temple being completed, sacrifices being done, and God himself filling the temple where the priests are not even able to continue their work. These accounts are parallel. In 1 Kings chapter 9 and 2nd Chronicles chapter 8, you have two parallel accounts of some of these same events regarding Solomon. Hiram comes up again, and there's a few different nuances between the accounts. Although they are parallel, you get some perspective. A little bit of conflict in the king's account between Hiram and Solomon that results in the future naming of certain cities. And in the Chronicles account, you can actually find out that the reason that Solomon built one of the houses for Pharaoh's daughter, his wife, or one of his wives, was because she was Egyptian, and he could not reconcile her living there in God's house in the temple with all of God's laws and mandates about keeping that which is holy, separate and pure, and obviously all the associations with Egyptian God. 1 Kings chapter 10 and 11 and 2nd Chronicles chapter 9 have two parallel accounts that summarize the end of Solomon's reign. You have some more positives, the Queen of Sheba bringing the gifts and many compliments to Solomon, and yet at the same time you see all the number of wives that he had that would bring about his downfall of the kingdom, the idolatry that would happen within the nation, worshiping all the different gods. And eventually, you see the prophecy that was given in Proverbs 29, verse 21, come to pass in Jeroboam, the servant of Solomon, becoming king of the 10 most northern tribes of Israel. And this would be something that would haunt Israel as we go forward. And you see these birth things kind of initially pointed out in these chapters here. 1 Kings chapter 12, 13, and 14. Here you have the beginning of two different storylines. You have the storyline of the northern kingdom, which is taken by Jeroboam, servant of Solomon, and the son of Solomon, Rehoboam. And from here you have 10 tribes in the north and 2 in the south. There is 3 years of honoring God in some way in the south, and in the north there is destruction and trouble. This would happen in the south as well. And interestingly enough, even though there is trouble in the north, Jeroboam is, I guess in some ways, kind of bookended with different prophets. Ahijah in the chapters we had already previously read, and then in these chapters, other prophecies that surround his story. So God is definitely present, even though people are not following him. In 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 1 through 24, you have the coverage of the reigns of Abijam and Asa, 2 kings of the southern kingdom that would follow Rehoboam. In 1 Kings 15, 25 through 34, and 1 Kings 16, 1 through 34, you have a lot of catch-up to happen in the northern kingdom. You will discover that much of the trouble that's going on leads to very short reigns for the kings that are there. And some of the people that take the throne don't even stay there any amount of time at all. And from this chart here, the amount of kings that you have just during the short period that we're covering in the southern kingdom, there's a lot of turnover on the throne in the north. That's not to say there's justice. 1 Kings 17, 18, and 19, we have a little bit of time where the chronology stops and hangs out during the time of Ahab, specifically because the prophets will now come onto the scene. Elijah and Elisha are introduced in these chapters. You have Elijah in the first couple chapters, and then the transition where Elisha comes into the scene in chapter 19. A very, very familiar and famous passage of the showdown between the prophets of Baal and Elijah, and God is showing his authority and his sovereignty, his power on Mount Carmel. That is chapter 18. And then the widow woman, many miracles involved in chapter 17 as well. So a lot to cover here in these chapters. Pray that it will bless you as you read. At the end of 1 Kings, these 3 chapters, 20, 21, and 22, you have conflict that bookends this section between Ahab and Ben-Hadad. You have international conflict that God himself wants to use to demonstrate his power. Even though Ahab is an evil king, he's wanting to give favor in this moment to show the difference between how a pagan god would be confined to a certain type of warfare or a certain climate or a certain deal, where God himself is sovereign regardless of the situation. And even the repentance that Ahab shows, which is met with favor from God, that is all struck down by the fact that chapter 21 is by far the lowest point of Ahab and Jezebel's wickedness. It comes in this form of Naboth's vineyard, and you can look at this as covetousness, but it's really much more than that. Not respecting God's laws, just disregarding where the family ancestors. 1 Kings 22 and 2 Chronicles 18 both tell of a compromise when it comes to Jehoshaphat having his son Jehoram married to Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab, and this was done to unite the kingdoms, and yet certainly was not a good move for him to do. The death of Ahab is also mentioned in these chapters as well. We talked about the judgment of God a little bit in the 1 Kings passage, but here you see that judgment is inevitable. The inevitable death of Ahab here in these chapters, as they know what's going to happen and they take account for that. Jehoshaphat takes the kingly position and garment and somehow is still not killed. Ahab, who's dressed as just a soldier, is shot by an arrow that was just released astray, and it finds a lodging place between his armor, in the joint of the armor, and he would die that day by sunset. Starting 2 Kings chapters 1 through 4, you begin with the death of Ahab and then the judgment of Ahaziah. And one confusing note in the procession here of these chapters, if you're comparing it with places you can just see elsewhere in the Bible. Joram here, it kind of lines up with Jehoram in the southern kingdom. And even though that's the case, and even sometimes Joram here is called Jehoram, these are... anyway, you have much in these chapters that really focuses on Elijah and Elisha. You have in the second chapter Elijah going up to heaven in the chariot of fire, the mantle being passed to Elisha, and after the long process with Moab in chapter 3, you have a lot of focus on the miracles. Chapter 4, Elisha has double the count of miracles of what you see from Elijah. Bless you. In 2 Kings chapter 5, you have the story of Naaman, who is healed of leprosy. And it's one of the interesting passages that Jesus quotes to blow the Pharisees' mind, in that salvation does not only belong to the Jews, it's a matter of repentance before God, and one that's not up to us, but it's up to Him in that way. And chapter 6 and 7 goes on to follow this kind of narrative between Syria and Israel. There's a lot of conflict that happens, and in the northern kingdom there's so much grief and hardship that the famine causes there to be cannibalism throughout the land. And in chapter 8 you see God sparing the Shunammite woman, who once again we had mentioned in chapter 4, if you read through the miracles, her son had been raised to life. She was told to go to the land of the Philistines and avoid all this conflict, and yet she gets her possessions back when she returns after 7 years. There's 3 Ben-Hadads through this time period, so it can be a little complicated. In 2 Kings 9, 10, and 11, you see the effect of Jehu, who is one anointed to take the throne. This is partially fulfilling the prophecy of the death of Jezebel, judgment against the house of Ahab, and so you have a lot of conflict here as Jehu goes on this rampage throughout the kingdom, not only against Ahab and the individuals involved, but also against all of the religious worship and Baal-centered sacrifices and prophets that are throughout the kingdoms. You see all this is happening in BC 841, and it covers quite a bit of ground. In the end, the southern kingdom is amazingly kinged by a 7-year-old Joash, or Jehoash, depending on the spelling you're finding. Second Kings chapter 12, 13, and 2 Chronicles chapter 24 cover the reign of Joash, and there's lots of good that happened during the reign of Joash. There's a restoration of the temple physically, and focus on getting back to true worship of God after all of the Baal worship that had followed the previous generations. And Jehoiada, the priest, was integral in Joash's following of God, and after a long and full life, 130 years in Jehoiada's passing, Joash would slip and turn away from God. Jehoiada's son actually prophesied against the king Joash and was killed, ironically, in a very humiliating fashion, even though Athaliah, the preceding queen of Israel, who was terrible for the country, had been spared by Jehoiada. In 2 Kings chapter 14 and 2 Chronicles chapter 25, you have the account of Amaziah, who is a king that walked with the Lord, but not as David did. And these parallel accounts both explain how eventually, through conflict, he got haughty, conquering the Edomites. He began to worship their gods after the battle, brought the spoils back with them, brought back the idols, and it specifically says they bowed down and worshiped them. In the end, this would lead to a conflict between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, again based on Amaziah's haughtiness. And despite prophecies and word against going forward, he would go forward, attack the northern kingdom. There would be much loss. And at the end of his days, where it says he's buried, it's not as a king, but he's just buried with his ancestors as if he were not a king. 2 Kings chapter 15 and 2 Chronicles chapter 26, you have this in which you have about 792 BC all the way down to 735 BC. And one interesting thing to note in the King's passage, that Azariah is kind of back and forth between that name and Uzziah. It's very clear in the Chronicles passage who is being talked about, because Uzziah is always consistently referred to as this king, whereas Azariah is the high priest. Leprosy is mentioned both where the king falls, and another important note beyond just the sin of Uzziah is that with all the conflict and compromise and turnover in the northern kingdom, again in the same time period, you have some of the northern kingdom that is conquered by Assyria, and that happens here in the reign of Pekah.
In 2 Chronicles 28 and 2 Kings 16, you have parallel accounts of Jotham, a king of Judah, which feels much compromise in the land. He's not buried with the other kings of the land and has lots of treaties that go against God's people. You have, in 2 Kings 17, moving into this reign of Hosea, where you have honestly, what has been a long time coming with the transgressions, the much wickedness that had been throughout the northern kingdom from the onset. And the Assyrians come, take over the land, take the Israelites out, bring others in. Even despite the attacks from lions and wild animals, them bringing a priest, an Israelite priest, back does not help the compromise that obviously continues throughout the land.
In 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 through 8, you have a introduction of Hezekiah, and we're told that he is the greatest king of Judah, no king like him before or after. And it's 2 Kings chapter 18, starting in verse 9, well through chapter 19 of 2 Kings, as well as Psalms 46, 80, and 135. There's themes of the nations and God being sovereign over all, and the power that he has that trumps any other power that you can tell. Hezekiah is the king of Judah when Sennacherib comes and the forces threaten and even conquers some of the lands there in Judah. The northern kingdom had been exiled by the Assyrian people, and you see the tenor of these psalms, the picturing of God as mighty and a warrior, a rescuer, one that makes the earth itself just seem absolutely minuscule and powerless in comparison. The Assyrian front speaks of all the other gods that had died, but we know that the true God was strong in spite of the surroundings.
1 Kings chapter 20 and 21. In chapter 20, you have one of the accounts of Hezekiah, his sickness that he was at the point of death. Isaiah visits him, and during this time, he has prayed to God, and God hears him, adds years to his life. Isaiah tells him specifically to put some figs at the spot where the boil is. And he was a great king. There's many things that he had done. One great historical fact that we even found today is the city tunnel that had brought water into the city that they found there underneath. Once he passed, Manasseh was not a good king, became king at 12 years of age, actually wound up sacrificing his own son later to pagan gods and did all type of other atrocities. He was eventually assassinated, and then his son Josiah would reign in his place. Bless you.
In some ways, it's almost fortuitous that I forgot Ammon yesterday, the son of Manasseh, who was the father of Josiah. This evil king was the one that was killed by conspirators. His reign was so short and evil that the details regarding his burial was completely left out. And in this sense, it's to show that because of his life, he in many ways was truly forgotten.
In 2 Kings 22, 23, and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35, you have King Josiah, who is given quite a bit of space in each of these historical books, primarily because of the justice, the mercy, all the wonderful attributes of this king represented and showed in his time. This was kind of the last-ditch shining light for the kingdoms before they would completely go into exile. So, of course, the southern king would begin as an 8-year-old, begin to follow God as a 16-year-old, and by the age of 20 was really doing great things throughout the land, bringing people back to God. They find the book. The priest Hilkiah, who's with them, finds the book of the law, likely some of the content from Deuteronomy, find it in the temple, and then begin to enact all of these things. And people really turn to God. The battle that ensues is actually the Egyptian forces coming to the aid of Nineveh and Assyria, who at that point are fighting against Babylon. And the passing through of the Pharaoh is a warning to Josiah, whether or not he knew it was from God or Pharaoh's God. Pharaoh said that this was not your affair, and just to leave me alone because the Lord, God's with me. Josiah actually disguises himself, and in spite of that, would be killed in battle against the Egyptian army. So all this transpires, and again, Josiah dies a pretty early death in the grand scheme of things. I'm only 39 years old, and it's said that he would be mourned throughout the land going forward. And of course, again, like I said, this is the final kind of bright moment for the kingdoms in that sense. Bless you. In 2 Kings 24, 25, and 2 Chronicles 36, you have the conclusion of these great historical books. Jerusalem is now falling at the end of these books. The king of Judah and the transition between these last few kings happens quickly. Jehoiakim is a evil king that does not please the Lord by any stretch. This reign is described, and after he passes, Jehoiakim takes the throne, is whisked away after Babylon besieges the city of Jerusalem, and likely Ezekiel as well as some others were taken out of the city at this time. Later, at the reign of Zedekiah, again somewhat brief, comes to an end. The city is ultimately defeated, and after this puppet king turns against Babylon, Zedekiah watches his own children die and then has his own eyes gouged out. Certainly a woeful end to this king who had many opportunities to surrender after reading and understanding the account of Jeremiah. The hope of the Book of Kings kind of ends on a little positive note that eventually you would see King Jehoiakim released after the time passes and Nebuchadnezzar is no longer in power. Of course, here and in 2 Chronicles, the future hope of a great messianic future and king is there, as well as the fact that there would be people that would return from the exile. The Babylonians did not infiltrate the culture as the Assyrians do, scattering the people. There were some that were able to remain in the city.